Hello, everybody. This is Chris Reeder. I'm a partner at Husch Blackwell in our Renewable Energy Group and our Energy and Natural Resources Group. I'd like to welcome everyone to this introductory webinar to kick off our webinar series that's entitled Building the Renewable Power Project, Navigating Practical Legal Problems in an Evolving Industry. This is a webinar series that will be focused on getting renewable projects on the ground and operating and into commercial operations and all of the challenges and issues that come up from a legal standpoint throughout that whole lifespan. So welcome, and we hope that you are able to join us in our future installments. Before we kick off today, though, I'd like to talk about a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your console, you'll find several application icons which you can use during the program today. And if you have any questions during our webcast, you can submit those by the question box. We'll try to answer all of those today on the webinar, but if we need to have a more fuller answer or if we run out of time, we'll try to answer those by email. Questions are very important. I think it really adds to the discussion and makes it interactive, so we really encourage y'all to submit any questions that you may have. A PDF of the presentation is available in the resources folder. We've been approved for legal education hours, and if you want to report those, you can click on the CEU icon at the bottom of your screen, and then a certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, as well as a recording of this webcast for later watching and enjoyment. Towards the end of the program, if you will, please complete our short survey. We really rely on these survey results to plan our future programs and use those to try and come up with programs that are of interest and usefulness to everybody out there in our industry. So that's all on housekeeping items. So let's go ahead and introduce our speakers and talk about our content. As I said, this is going to be the first of a entire series on helping participants work through and develop practical roadmaps to navigate issues that arise in the course of developing renewable power projects. And so two of my partners are here with me today to go through that introduction and talk about just in general where we are in the industry. The first is John Crossley, and many of you have worked with John, and you know that he advises both traditional and renewable energy companies seeking to acquire, develop, construct, or finance projects and assets. John leads teams of talented, experienced attorneys to prepare projects for disposition and acquire, developed, or operating projects. And John is located in our Kansas City office, but handles matters throughout the country. Also joining us is Kaki Jewett, who also focuses on the renewable energy industry and has practiced real estate law for almost 20 years. And in the renewable energy context, she also leads teams in project development and project investment. And she is in our Austin office, or at least our Austin virtual office during this crazy time. But Kaki also, while she works on a number of Texas matters, Kaki also looks at and participates in deals concerning the entire United States. So that's the program and our speakers, and I'm happy now to turn it over to my partner, John Crossley.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Like Chris said, this is the first in a monthly series of presentations that our Energy and Natural Resources group is going to conduct. And what we really want is for this series of presentations to be interactive, and that goes beyond just the typical presentation request for questions that you usually see, but we'd like, during the course of the conversation today and, until the next presentation, please think of some different topics that you would like to hear input on, or any subsets of topics that we've got listed up on your screen right now with the titles and dates of the upcoming presentations. Nothing anymore is the same week to week, let alone month to month, and we want to be able to provide the most up-to-date and relevant information that we possibly can. And some of that information is going to necessarily change over the course of the next 2 or 3 months. And so if there is a set of particular questions you'd like to be answered or items that you'd like to be discussed, we would really like to be able to use your input to make these presentations as useful as humanly possible, and we could certainly use and would appreciate your help to do that. Some of these presentations are going to be panel discussions. Some of them are going to be more traditional presentations, but the more input we have from those of you out in the industry, the better and more useful I think that we can make these. So getting into the presentation, what we maybe thought we would do for the first several slides is just kind of lay out where the global energy industry is as a whole, and then more particularly where the U.S. renewable industry also sits. And this first chart that we've got shows that, really to nobody's surprise, after holding steady for a couple of years, the investment in energy across the globe is falling. So nobody's surprised at all. If you look at the 4 combined years here, you can see that the power sector and the energy use and efficiency sectors have held relatively steady from 2017 through 2019 and then into 2020, but the biggest hit this year has really been in the fuel supply sector. These 2 charts right here, go a little bit farther in breaking down what we saw first, and it shows, on the left chart shows that, coal has generally held very low but steady. Natural gas sector by sector investment is holding also steady. The power sector is increasing. It shows a small drop here at the beginning of 2020, and then oil, you can really note the ups and downs of that market, and then the tremendous down here at the beginning of 2020. Then over on the right, taking a look again, you can see that the oil and gas estimated investment in 2019 and 2020 is estimated to be down 32%. Coal was, down already, is down 15%. Even the power sector is down 10, and energy end use and efficiency is down 12. I mentioned coal very quickly, and I might pick on it a little bit during the first couple of slides anyway. But in 2019, you had a significant number of coal requirements, and coal's share of the U.S. energy generation, electric generation, is predicted to drop from 28% in 2018 down to 25% last year, and then 22% in 2020, and continue to fall. One last time, this slide's a different representation of the declines that we've witnessed in 2020, but also further broken down into different sectors. And while you can see, the green 3 bars in the middle from 2018, 2019, and 2020, you can see that renewable power has dropped in 2020, but you can really see the declines that have occurred in upstream oil and gas and midstream oil and gas. Everything's taken a hit, but the last 3 charts have really kind of showed us what kind of a hit oil and gas has taken. I think that really all of us think that natural gas is going to be a continued dominant presence, but even then there are some fairly recent studies that showed that, if we built up to capacity in terms of natural gas, we would start to see those facilities become economic as soon as the next 20 to 15 years. So the industry is going to continue to be in flux, and a lot of what we know now is, not going to be the case in the recent future. So it, is going to help us to stay abreast of everything that's going on. Now we're going from a worldwide basis down to power generation in the U.S. This chart here will kind of show us what the 10-year trends have been by energy sector in the U.S., and then the dotted lines on the far right are projections for the end of 2020 and 2021. Here you've got the relative dominance of natural gas, that's the blue line, and the drastic decline of coal on the brown line. You would expect nuclear energy, you can see on the green line, has been relatively flat, and then the yellow line starts to show the uptick in renewable energy generation starting really in earnest in about 2015. This next slide here then shows each one of those sectors, but by percentage growth since the beginning of 2011. And there, the blue line again represents natural gas, which has had nice healthy growth, but the yellow line there is renewable energy. And you see how that is edging up towards natural gas in terms of percentage growth, and is projected to really, if the projections hold true, to have already surpassed natural gas. Just the data for the beginning of 2019 and 2020 isn't available just yet. This slide is, something of a throwaway, but for obvious reasons, it kind of entertains me. And you can see the point in 2019 where renewable energy consumption as a whole surpassed coal energy. You could see the steady decline of coal energy, and then the point at which really largely boosted by solar, wind, and biofuels, the renewable energy industry has overtaken coal, and that's good news for a number of reasons. One, at least in my opinion, the decline of the usage of coal is good for all of us, and the increase in the use of renewables is also good for our community and our industry. So now we can start to even break the information further and look specifically at the renewable energy sector and consumption rates in the renewable energy sector. Here we can tell that across all consumption sectors, residential, commercial, industrial, transportation, wind energy is on the rise. Wind energy is the light blue line that you see there. Hydro is also doing very well in terms of overall consumption, but it's been, there are the ups and downs on a year-over-year basis, but the trend line is pretty steady. Then you have wood biomass, which is the kind of dark red line there, nuclear, solar, then again as the yellow line, you can see that really starting to trend up. And as a percentage growth in this slide here, this is the same as what we saw earlier. You see the growth since, in this case, it's just 2015 to really kind of show the sharp increase in solar energy consumption over the past 5 years, and the amount that it's projected to increase over the next year. So you've got the yellow line, which is solar, you've got the light blue line that is wind, and then really everything else has basically held steady. And as you can see on the figures on the left-hand side of your screen, while solar experienced almost a 200% growth rate, wind a 90% growth rate. Hydro and other fuel types start to, or all other generation types start to, lose a little bit of steam in comparison. I think this is a really interesting chart, and it starts to show where wind and solar PPA prices have gone over the last 12 years, and then really since 2015, and that's the point that both wind and solar project prices were below the levelized 20-year gas price projections. And it's interesting for that reason, but also interesting if you look at the blue and yellow circles that are on the chart, and if you look back into 2010 and a couple of years on either side of that, especially with respect to wind projects, the larger circles on the chart represent larger projects, smaller ones, of course, smaller projects, and you can see the prices really start to narrow to along that trend line in both the case of wind and solar as the industry matures. In 2010, you were kind of all over the place, regardless of project size, and now, while there's always going to be a few outliers, everything is really gravitating towards that trend line, and both according to the Berkeley Lab and FERC and EIA, the prices on both wind and solar are scheduled to, anticipated to still be below gas price projections. Here, specific to wind, we've got another graph that shows where wind power project costs have gone over the past 30 years. And you can really see the maturation of the industry over the past 15 years. And once again, where project costs are starting to gravitate towards that trend line regardless of project size, even on the very, very small projects, which you can see by the small dots that are at the top of the graph, even those start to go away over time, and everything starts to trend to the weighted average capacity project costs, and everything is still continuing to trend much lower. Same information here, but on the PV side, what you can tell here, the bars represent the average. The bars represent the average installed capacity year over year, while the yellow line shows PV prices. And prices are going up, or prices are going down, and installed capacity is going way, way up, even when you consider what the 2020 estimates are going to be here in the United States. Finally, just because it's the topic that everybody will talk about, take a look at this chart, which is the impact of COVID on U.S. energy consumption. And we've all seen a bunch of graphs where we note how our lifestyles have changed, and the effects of that. I think one that was very proper, or very widely distributed, was the map that showed how little everybody started to move around at the end of April based on mobile phone data. Everybody saw the stock market, of course, but this one shows that at the beginning of 2020, energy consumption plummeted to September of 1989 levels, which is really kind of astonishing when you get down and start to think about it. We all felt the change in our lifestyles, but this graph really illustrates how a single load point for energy really starts to drop off energy consumption on a nationwide basis. EIA forecasts that we're going to have 3.6% less electricity consumption in 2020 compared with 2019. You can see here in this chart that in at the end of Q2 of 2020, the consumption was way down, with the dotted line showing the anticipated increases towards the end of the year. The impact on wind energy specifically, what we've got is I think everybody witnessed this as well. It's a slowing of the growth during the onset of the pandemic. My own personal experience was that a lot of that slowdown in growth, and it was really very stark at the end of March and the beginning of April, was people really just trying to figure out where their lives were at and what to do with their kids and how to work from home. And once people got their legs back under them again, there were certainly new issues that were present for all of us to consider, but the pace of project finance and development has really ramped right back up again. So, that's in keeping with all the data that we've seen and all the data that we've presented here. I think we've got some people that are starting to report that they've had trouble securing investors, and that goes back to what we heard from lenders and tax equity investors back in April, where there was a flight to quality of projects, and people's underwriting standards have tightened, and it makes it hard to find investors for projects. Hopefully that trend is going to reverse itself. I think you're always going to have a flight to quality, and quality projects are always going to be easy to finance and find investors for than others. But for those of us who primarily represent people on the developer side, hopefully the standards loosen and people will have a little bit less risk aversity than they've had in the last couple of months. Here's another chart that shows us the impacts on the solar industry as opposed to the wind industry. Distributed solar has really been hit hard, and the expectation is that we're going to see 31% fewer installations in 2020 than in 2019. The projections, though, through 2025 are strong, but they are down compared to the predictions that were made as recently as 2019. We'll all have to stay tuned and see where that goes. I think that, again, from a personal perspective, I think that there are a lot of positive signs and a lot of people that are starting up development efforts again. So hopefully we'll see that largely on the utility side of things, and the distributed side, depending on where the economy goes and depending as people get more, if you want to call this disposable income availability that they would use for distributed solar projects, especially on the residential side, that's obviously going to be somewhat difficult to predict over the course of the next year or so. That's the end of that part of the presentation and just kind of where things stand. At this point, we're happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation, but for now, I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Kathy Jewett, down in Texas.
Okay, thanks, John. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and start covering briefly a few of the topics that we're going to be talking about in our upcoming webinars. So the first thing we're looking at here is Greenfield development, but within that sort of larger topic, we decided to focus specifically on figuring out what to do with minerals, since that's a really big upfront topic and a very significant issue, especially for solar. It's also an issue in the storage context, and wherever it could even be an issue on wind as well. We've had a situation with a wind developer who had a high productive area of the state, and that county was really busy with minerals. And being a wind project, they weren't too concerned about sort of balancing out those interests, but ended up with a pretty narrow corridor for their gen-tie line, and discovered sort of late in the game that was an area that a mineral developer also had targeted for production. So kind of in all the renewable areas, it's something that you have to think about. Just as a little background, for those who aren't that familiar, minerals typically can be severed from the surface estate, and they could be severed many, many times, and that can really complicate the ownership. Mineral severances may not be in the real property records, so if you're looking at a title pro forma or a title commitment, it may or may not show the mineral ownership. So that's something to think about. And as I mentioned, it's always something that you want to get started on early. So you want to consider whatever your siting and your project design needs are, and you want to try to think ahead as much as you can and build in as much flexibility as you can, thinking about sort of setting aside drill site areas if that might be needed, and really thinking through your plan. And then a big part of that is also making sure that you know who owns those minerals. So you can use a landman for research in that area. The landman can also help you locate the mineral rights owners and lessees, and can even help you in negotiation. So even though, we've got a situation, as we saw, where oil and gas prices are down right now, that doesn't mean that that minerals could be any less of an issue for you. Financing parties are always focused on that. Title companies are focused on it. The mineral rights are dominant over the surface in many cases, and mineral owners are also fairly savvy. And if you wait and you don't start early, that can really increase the leverage of the mineral owners and the mineral lessees, which obviously isn't what you want to do. So continuing on the sort of the minerals focused in Greenfield, as I mentioned, setting aside drill site areas is something that you may need to do if you have an active area. And the way you do that is you enter into an accommodation agreement with the lessee typically, and that can take quite a while to negotiate. So that's another reason that you want to do that early. Similarly, looking at title, you want to make sure that you're getting a hold of your title company early. You're probably going to want to negotiate express coverage over any mineral issues that you may have. The kind of a loose rule of thumb, and I almost didn't put this in here because I really kind of hate to put any number in, but went ahead and put in 75% as the typical requirement on surface waivers that you might need. But that said, it's really never a one-size-fits-all situation. You have to look at the county. You have to look at the activity there. You have to look at the history of activity there. It matters who any lessees may be. All of those kind of things matter. And it also matters who your title company is, because title companies, some are more conservative and some are less conservative. And from the developer perspective, of course, you want to work with someone who's a little bit less conservative and may be willing to listen to your case on why in a particular situation you really only need 50% surface waivers or something like that. And then as a last resort, you also might need to bring in lawyers who would write a mineral opinion. That could also be required. So from here, I'm going to touch a little bit on another one of our future topics, which is construction, particularly in the pandemic era. So as everybody probably knew early on, there were many questions coming up, things like, is construction on my wind project or my solar project considered essential work? In many places, the answer was yes, but there were exceptions, Pennsylvania, for example. So questions like that were coming up early on, and many of them have been answered. But of course, the situation is always changing. So you got to stay on top of those things. And we could end up with a second wave if we haven't already. So got to sort of reassess those things as they come up. Another thing that came up during that time that is kind of an ongoing and also changing question is safety protocols. We answered a lot of questions for clients in this area on those topics there, those examples mentioned. Travel restrictions, for example, early on, we didn't have restrictions between states in the U.S., but now that's different. So that could be an issue. We also had a client whose contractor was Canadian, and really early in the pandemic, they decided that they should pull everybody out of the U.S., and they picked up and sent everyone home to Canada. Well, that was obviously not anticipated and a big issue for the developer. So those kind of things have to be worked through and could be ongoing issues. And that kind of leads to the next bullet, which is delays. So we have addressed, we actually have a blog at Husch Blackwell in our energy group that has done some pretty extensive looking at the force majeure questions under construction contracts during COVID. But a couple tips out of that, just as an overview, you definitely want to review the contract closely. You might have to mitigate damages, so you want to look at that for sure. Also, just as under construction contract issues, liquidated damages versus penalties has been a question that we've had to look at quite a bit too. Are the liquidated damages enforceable, or are they unenforceable as a penalty? And the general rule was always that they were not enforceable, but the modern trend is that liquidated damages may be enforceable if they are correctly tied to the damage that occurs. You've got to really show the right connection. So that's another issue that's been coming up for our team, and that we could talk about more as we get to that more detailed presentation. And a couple other issues we've listed here. These are not COVID-specific issues, but they are topics that we've recently had questions on from more than one developer client. So in the bond context, we've had a lot of questions regarding what's a statutory bond versus a common law bond, and which is applicable in the state where my project is located. We've had to do some looking at that. We've also had questions about performance bonds and whether they extend to cover the warranty period. In Texas, for example, they may. Also, it's good to keep in mind, if you are in the context of a statutory bond, there are a lot of practical requirements, and you want to make sure that you're meeting all of those practical requirements. For example, exercising on the bond can actually be a very slow process, and COVID may make that harder. We had a client also in that circumstance where it was a good construction contract, good bond, good surety, everything was in place, except that the issue became for the client, there were a lot of notice provisions, there were waiting periods and meetings that were required, really lengthening the process of exercising on the bond. So it made it difficult for the client to really utilize that in an expeditious manner. Also, on the practical side, if you are dealing with an upcoming closing and you're wanting to make sure that any lien claims are not affecting the real property, then if you're in a state where that could be the case, you have to absolutely follow the statutory requirements. And if you don't, the title company might not recognize that bond as serving the purpose that it should. So another sort of similar, not COVID-specific construction issue is also mechanics and materialmen's liens. Similar to bonds, you've got to look at it on a state-by-state basis. There can be the unique state issues. And then similarly in the lien waiver context. So you want to make sure that you're checking your contracts up front, or you're having an attorney who's familiar with those local laws, looking at them to make sure that if the local laws require certain provisions or certain language, that you're complying with that. And with that, I am going to shift to you, Chris.
Thanks a lot, Khaki, and thanks again, everybody. So I'm going to shift gears, and we're going to take it away from construction and COVID and the like, and talk about our installment that's going to deal with permitting and environmental approvals and such. And then, time permitting, talk a little bit about a later installment that's going to deal more with RTOs and FERC and state-level regulatory. Before I dive into all that, though, kind of inspired by John, I want to talk a little bit about some ERCOT-specific statistics, which I wasn't as motivated as John to include some graphics, but nonetheless, given that ERCOT is such a renewables-intensive market and system, I think may be of some interest to folks on the call, which is that in respect of COVID, ERCOT has reported that it hasn't really seen too much of an impact on the system. It reported that roughly in April, it began to notice approximately a 2% reduction in weekly energy usage, but that peak demands were roughly the same or not as affected. It did observe that there has been a significant 6 to 10% reduction in morning loads from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m., but that after that time, demand roughly would catch up. And so the impact, I think, was more of a kind of temporal allocation of demand rather than overall. Lately, the past couple of weeks, in ERCOT's running reports on COVID's impact on the grid, it's reported that morning load phenomenon has essentially abated. If there's any impact, it's in the 1% range. That COVID has not affected peak demands. It has had a very slight impact on our 4CP peaks, and has noted that in its updates. Another thing I kind of wanted to note here before getting into the permitting talk is ERCOT reported that this year, in fact this summer, we achieved a record wind generation on the system on June 28th of 21,375 megawatts. So that's, kind of in the thick of the pandemic, as well as a wind penetration record in May of this year, May 2nd, of 59.30%. That's almost 60% of all the energy on the system is generated just from wind. That tells me a couple of things. It tells me that investors, it tells me that customers, I think those that are in the market are still plunging ahead, maybe that's not the right word, moving ahead with developing renewable projects, of operating renewable projects, of actively participating in ERCOT markets. So, whatever the forecast is, it's still on the uptick for renewables. The other thing it tells me is that in our smaller ERCOT grid, ERCOT is going to begin, in fact already has, to need to think about how that plays out as far as running the system. And what I mean by that is regulation, load following, intermittent nature of some of these resources as they continue to play a bigger role in the overall resource mix. And I think ERCOT has been on top of that through it's expanded and more intense focus on distribution level resources, on load resources and how those can participate in wholesale markets, modeling some of this smaller scale generation and being able to factor it into resource analysis. And also it's gotten a little bit more ahead on focusing on transmission congestion, which if time permitting I'd like to get to as well. So a little bit more of a challenge for ERCOT, but historically they've proven that they're able to deal with this challenge very effectively. But otherwise, it looks like a lot of participation on the increase for renewable market participants. So with that slight detour out of the way, let me return to our slides and preview our upcoming installment on permitting, environmental approvals, and that is both at the state and national levels, but county and local levels as well. That's a big part of these renewable projects. The presenters are going to be Megan Caldwell, who's in our Denver office, and Megan has practiced in the environmental area for many years and has focused very exclusively on renewable projects, and a number of you have no doubt worked with Megan. Ben Busboom will also be presenting. Ben is relatively new to our firm, but has a wealth of experience on environmental matters and has worked on a lot of pipeline and other infrastructure type projects over the years, and he is in our Omaha office. So permitting-wise, we've got some various bullet points that this webinar will delve into some of the details. I think we're going to try and focus on a more coherent or cohesive approach towards permitting in the development process. And, you know, what follows will not be any great revelation other than it seems to be a product of afterthought sometimes rather than forethought and meticulous advanced planning, which is to say that rather than scraping at the last minute to nail down permit deficiencies or have we got everything, you know, being the subject of a weekly call, you know, I think it profits everyone to lay out in advance of every project a schedule of every permit that's needed. And as to each permit, the agency, the plan for obtaining the permit, the responsibility for obtaining the permit, what sort of ongoing monitoring would be needed, and in particular the timing of the permit, and in particular synced up with the development calendar. And that's something that I think we see, I don't know about a lot, but I think is something of a challenge, which is sometimes you get silos in which the developers, the originators, they have a calendar that is more of a commercial calendar and is in partnership with potential off-takers or investors. And then on the other hand, you might have a regulatory team or somebody working in a different area that has their matrix of permits that are needed for wind plants, and maybe there's not as much coordination as might be ideal. So I think in this installment that I'm describing, we're going to kind of go over what a very beneficial and effective approach might be towards combining these calendars, you know, setting some realistic expectations about what permits are needed, what to be expected in the timeline, what are some realistic parameters for how long it will take to obtain these permits, and in acquisition type scenarios, how to sort through those in the diligence context, and to determine whether, you know, some deficiencies are showstoppers or whether they're capable of being remedied after the fact, whether they, you know, are something that can be dealt with after a closing. So we're going to approach that. as far as some of these bullets go, Megan and Ben will be talking about some recent developments in the affected laws, in particular the changes by court decisions with respect to the Nationwide Permit 12 and how that implements the Corps of Engineers jurisdiction over renewable projects, and a recent decision finding that the rule would be suspended, and that it, in any case, would not apply to renewable projects. And also with respect to the definition of the waters of the United States, which would impact the Clean Water Act, and how to implement those changes for Section 404 permits involving crossings or other impacts that might impact renewable projects to the extent they can't get nationwide permits. On the timeline for environmental studies, that's sort of the same consideration that I expressed more generically earlier, but in terms of environmental studies in particular, Megan and Ben will talk about how we typically want to look to nailing down wildlife studies earlier, sometimes up to 2 years ahead of time, as well as consultation with localities, and how other types of studies, such as stormwater construction permit, transportation permits, sometimes can wait until just months or even weeks before construction begins, and they'll talk about what the consequences might be of applying for permits too early. As far as footprint or layout changes, Megan and Ben are going to talk about some practical aspects of that. And Garrett, again, I think it's a permutation of sort of methodically and comprehensively looking at the downstream impacts before you make that decision to move a turbine, expand or alter the project layout, change the name of the project, be to identify upfront all of the affected permits, to talk about and agree on a schedule for making necessary adjustments, evaluating the effectiveness of your permits, should the changes be pushed through, or whether prior approval would be needed. So we're going to talk about that, and then also on permit expirations. That's if you have a regulatory department, then often that kind of gets consigned to the regulatory department, but it's critical, particularly when you're an organization that has a lot of projects with a lot of permits and necessary renewals, to track those, to establish spreadsheets, to establish triggers that alert everyone that it's time to re-up for your let's say your ERCOT generating capacity report, which is an annual thing. So that's to put in a plug for anybody who's in a regulatory department. You miss one or two of those permit renewals, and all of a sudden you may be looking at a situation where you've got to stop operating, and that's not going to make anybody happy. So Megan and Ben are going to talk about that, and the proper permittees being named on permits comes up a lot. We see this when we do these projects where you might have an early stage developer that goes out and acquires a number of permits or makes some registrations in their name, and then when they assign the project to its next owner, they assign the project, but sometimes it's necessary to go back and renew or amend all of those permits to get the right name. And so you have to build in flexibility into your schedule for doing that. And then finally, Megan in particular, who's dealt with the FAA a lot in these DNHs, is going to talk about some peculiarities of their practice and some of their nuances and their ever-evolving procedures. So we're getting kind of close towards the end. Let me just turn to this next slide briefly and say that while it's not in our immediate calendar of future webinars, we're thinking that in the coming year, 2021, we're going to have some additional webinar installments, and that among those would be a webinar that reviews regulatory developments and kind of market developments. That would be with some of my colleagues, including Sylvia Bartell, who's an attorney in our D.C. office, and Maria Facanti, who's also in our Austin office. And I think a lot of y'all have worked with Sylvia and Maria. And they're going to, they would, kind of lay out a similar plan towards achieving regulatory approvals and registrations and interconnection studies and interconnection agreements in a way that overlays with and is consistent with project development schedules, as well as how to build in some flexibility for the fact that a lot of these utilities and RTOs and state agencies, they operate on a different schedule than a commercial development timeline, which is a crucial thing to understand and work with. Maria and Sylvia will talk about, kind of the latest significant FERC activities, developments at the RTO level, some NERC changes, and Texas-specific items as well. I had hoped to get into some of those, but I think probably just will stand down here and go through whatever questions we have. I think also, this regulatory presentation we're talking about, it's kind of important to have this after the election. I know here in Texas, for example, the thought is that there is a significant or a realistic possibility that at least the Texas House of Representatives may become majority of the Democratic Party, which means there'd be a new speaker and new committee chairs. That would have a significant impact on Texas legislation affecting renewables. So good to kind of get that under our belts, I think, before we have that installment. So happy to talk to anybody at any time about some of these issues, but for purposes of the webinar, we did want to preserve a little bit of time to address anybody's questions. So looks like there's a couple that have come in, and I'm happy to read those out. And John and Kaki, if you want to address some of those, although it looks to me like there's just really a couple of comments. So maybe instead of that, if John or Kaki, if you had any other thoughts, maybe as prompted by these questions that did come in, or if anybody does have any questions, now's the time to go ahead and submit those, and we do have a couple more minutes. Otherwise, I'll just kind of turn it back to John and Kaki and see if you have any other thoughts in closing, and if there's no questions, then we can just kind of wind it down.
Chris, I don't see any more questions coming in at this point. One thing that occurred to me as I was looking at your regulatory markets map, I know that Lubbock area, wasn't it moving out of SPP and into ERCOT, and I was just curious if what the status was on that.
Right. Most of Lubbock is moving into ERCOT. In fact, if you go to the ERCOT website, ERCOT now shows the Lubbock area as being part of ERCOT. The ISO and the transmission utilities throughout ERCOT have been studying and have identified several transmission improvements that have to be implemented to reliably integrate that Lubbock load into ERCOT, and also for generation resources in that area to be able to flow into the ERCOT system as well. A couple of those projects have already received PUC approval, and I think there is still a Lubbock Integration Task Force that meets, that's identifying any additional elements and is keeping track of how that process goes. Kind of another interesting thing that I think should be mentioned in respect of Lubbock is that as Lubbock comes into the system, it comes in an area that's experiencing greater congestion. The competitive renewable energy zone transmission network of 18 gigawatts that was developed over 10 years ago is now, rather profoundly oversubscribed. And so ERCOT is noticing increased congestion and constraints out in West Texas, which is where, kind of the lion's share of our wind resources are. And at the same time, oil and gas loads and demand out in West Texas are also on the increase, even with the economic slowdown. So, you've got so much system activity, and then when you throw in, this load center into ERCOT in that zone, it's a real area for focus. So I guess to get back to your question, Lubbock is going to integrate, and the necessary elements to facilitate that have been identified, and they're on the way. So soon we'll have a ERCOT system that includes most of Lubbock's load. I see also we did get a question, and there's still a couple of minutes left. What is the status of the MOPR ruling from FERC as it applies to renewable resources that may have state-sponsored subsidies? My understanding is that the result is that FERC did rule that those resources that have state subsidies, if I can check my notes here, but that it was adverse to renewables. And if you'll just bear with me one moment. I believe that was in the PJM capacity market, that if you receive a state subsidy, that you're not eligible for the minimum offer price. And so you won't be able to participate in that capacity market if you receive a state subsidy. My notes, which come from Sylvia Bartell, who will be presenting at that particular webinar, are that the FERC commissioners, other than the one from the Democratic appointment, intentionally set out in that order to achieve that result, to exclude renewables from the PJM capacity market. And as a consequence of writing the order kind of to achieve that result, Sylvia's opinion is that the order might not be able to withstand appellate scrutiny, that it might have some logical flaws and may not be able to meet the reasoned decision standard that's in the Administrative Procedures Act. So I'm sorry for stammering, having to check my notes, but FERC has made a decision on that. They have excluded renewables that receive a state subsidy from that capacity market, but almost certainly a court appeal will be on the way. We do have another minute or so. There's a question, what is your outlook for coal production and regulation? So, John, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think that one largely depends on, you hate to defer everything until after the presidential election, but I think that's a big factor in where things are going to go. Otherwise, even with the last 4 years and the administration, you've continued to see a decline in coal production. And so I think it's a foregone conclusion that it's going to continue to decline. I think that the question is probably based on the rate, or is probably related to the rate of decline, and I think we'll just have to kind of see how the next couple of months bear out.
Okay, I think we are just over our 1 o'clock time. Any other questions that come in, we will circle back to you all by email. But this is the end of our webinar, and thank you all for joining us today. We hope this was helpful to you and your organization. And be sure to join us at our next installment, which is going to be on September 24th, and that will be a focus on EPC and BOP contracts and COVID. This program has been approved for legal education hours. As a reminder, and to report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of your screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Be sure to complete our short survey. We do use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to whatever you need. And as John mentioned early on, we definitely want to hear from you all, especially if you have something in mind you would like to have us cover. So this concludes our webinar, and thanks everybody for attending. Have a great afternoon.